Okay. So, what is an idol? The first mention of idols, as we mentioned before in previous Bible studies, we like to look at the first mention of a word so that we could get a full understanding of it. A lot of times, if we look at the first mention of a word in the Bible, that'll give us more context and understanding of what that word means. So, if we're trying to understand idols, we can go and search up where the word idol was first mentioned in the Bible. And when I was looking it up, I actually found that it was idols that was mentioned before idol. So that's just something to keep in mind is that play between plural and singular is actually pretty important. But the first mention is idols in Leviticus 19:4, which reads, "Do not put your trust in idols or make metal images of gods for yourselves. I am the Lord Yah, your God." So again, idols, is the plural and it's in alignment with images of gods. That word idols was actually in the Strong's Concordance H457. So again, the Strong's Concordance is the alignment of the Hebrew words with those translations. So if we look up the Hebrew root word of idols, it's elil, and that word means worthless, good for nothing, vain, or vanity. So Yah is calling the items that we create as images of gods worthless, right? And you could go to the next slide. So let's look at that word gods too, right? So in the same verse, we're looking at idols, and those are images of God. So we also have to know what a god is, these little g's gods. So that word is H430, which is Elohim. Rulers, judges, divine ones. So this word emphasizes an entity of spiritual power. So some sort of spiritual authority in some sort of way. So Yah is essentially saying, don't put your trust in idols or make metal images of these small spiritual authorities. And then in the last slide, I remember we had the picture of like different statues, images that are created of gods, right? So if you go to Greece today, you'll see a bunch of statues of Greek gods that represented those statues represent those gods, right? So it's those statues, those images of those gods. They're very intertwined. Can go on to the next slide. So we were just talking about Leviticus, but Leviticus is not the first or the second book in the Bible, right? So there's backstory to Leviticus. Leviticus is already talking about the law, and Leviticus is written by Moses, and we're already at that point. So we need some backstory about Exodus before we can understand how we got to this point of Yah calling these idols worthless in Leviticus. So in Exodus 1, just to recap, I know most of us have probably heard the story before, but Exodus 1 details the suffering that Israel endures as slaves in Egypt. So if we read Exodus 1, we see this story of bondage and the state of the nation of the Israelites who are treated as slaves within Egypt. And then in Exodus 2, Moses is born. So Moses, we know later Yah is going to use to deliver the people of Egypt, but this is the context that Moses is born into. He's born into Egypt and he's born into this time of being persecuted in a way of by the Egyptian people. And then Exodus 3, God appears to Moses in the burning bush and introduces himself as Yahweh, the God of his fathers who recognizes the afflictions of the people. So again, they're in a really bad state while they're in Egypt, but God is recognizing the afflictions of the people and saying that he's going to deliver them from this situation in Egypt. And then Exodus 4 through 14, Yah brings the 10 plagues upon Egypt. So the 10 plagues, um, we'll go over that a little bit. But Pharaoh lets the people go, and the Red Sea is parted, and now the people are free from Egypt. So I know I'm kind of brushing over that a little bit, But in a way, that's the story that we all kind of heard, right? We heard these 10 plagues came about Egypt, and then y'all parted the Red Sea, and then they were free from Egypt, and yay, everything is great, right? And that's kind of where, if we watch movies like The Prince of Egypt, the story drops us off. It kind of leaves us there. But after that, in Exodus 15 through 18, the Israelites are now in the wilderness. So after they come through all of that situation, they're in the wilderness. They don't necessarily go to this grand place or to the promised land yet. They're now just there. And they start to get a little restless. So we'll see that in Exodus 15 through 18. However, Yah continues to provide and leads them to Mount Sinai, where he invites them into a relationship with him. So that's kind of the backstory of Exodus, is the story of them being in a really bad situation in Egypt, them being slaves in Egypt, being treated very brutally, and then Yah coming and delivering them from that situation. But at this point now in Exodus, they're like, now what? We're in the wilderness. We don't really know what's going on, right? So Exodus 19, 5 through 6 is that invitation where he's saying, I just delivered you all from Egypt. Um, Now this is the relationship that I want to have with you. So he says, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me and fully keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you are to speak to the Israelites. So this is the kind of the setup, right? Where he's saying, he's reminding them, I just pulled you guys out of Egypt and I just did all these things for you. And this is what I want to do now. This is the relationship that I want to have with you, and this is what I want to do for you as a nation. And then the Ten Commandments, which are found in Exodus 20, are the terms of this relationship. So it's this full story from Exodus leading up to this moment of the Ten Commandments. So the first commandment is in Exodus 20 through 2 through 3. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Again, how many times do we just say that God is telling them, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt? That keeps being reiterated, right? So once we know that once Yah is repeating something, there's probably something very important to that. Out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, so reminding them of the situation that they were in Egypt. And you shall have no other gods before me. So he reminds them of who he is, his power, and what they've been delivered from before he tells them that they should have no other gods, that little g, before him. They should not subject themselves to any other spiritual authority. So we broke that word gods down to Elohim, which also can be seen as some sort of spiritual authority. And he's saying, you should have no other gods above me. I am this powerful God, and you should not put these things above me. Next slide. Which leads us to the second commandment, which is in Exodus 2:4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. So remind yourselves of that. That word carved image there is pesel, which means a graven image, just a carved image, also translated as idol. So if we think back to the first mention that we mentioned earlier in Leviticus, talking about these carved images, meaning they're embodiments of gods, right? So he's saying, I don't want you to have any of these carved images, any of these idols. And we'll go to the next slide. And the consequence of that, so second commandment continued, is you must not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. So this second commandment has, where the first one it just said, have no other gods. This second commandment of not creating idols has this whole consequence that goes with it, right? He's really going in depth as to why worshiping these idols, having these idols, he does not like it. He's told us many times that he doesn't, right?
Where you going? Mm-mm. I'll go find it right now. Let me put Papa's down. Oops, sorry. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom. Yeah, the next one. So the second commandment context. So we're like, at this point, why is Yah so concerned with idols? It's seeming like it's a very deep situation, this idols thing. Why is he so upset about idols? But again, he just said that he delivered them from Egypt. And Egypt, who they've just been delivered from, worshipped many gods. So the Israelites, they should have an understanding of what these gods are because they just came from a nation that worshiped them, right? They've seen what that looks like, and they have an understanding of what he means by gods and idols because they've seen it firsthand. And these gods had heads of alligators, birds, and bodies of men. So remember, he said nothing in the air above or in the water below. He said to not make those carved images of those things. So he's directly speaking to them and the things that they know and saying, I don't want you to have these idols. I don't want you to create these little gods, right? And the other nations around them did the same, right? So Egypt was not the only nation at this time that had idols, that had gods. You can go to the next slide. So that brings us to the real first mention of the word idols. So like we mentioned before, idols are can also there's like three different definitions of idols in the Bible. And like we mentioned, there was that carved images, right? So if you actually look at the first mention of carved images, it's going to take you to Genesis 31:19, which says and Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. So this is talking about Rachel, Jacob's wife, and these images that she stole from her father's home. So it's showing back in Genesis and back in these ancient times, idols existed as a concept before Yah made it a commandment to not worship them. All these ancient civilizations, all of the nations around Israel before Egypt, before they ended up in slavery to Egypt, there were idols existing. Continue. But what he wants us to know is that idols were embodiments, images of gods, those Elohim, those spiritual authorities. But where we in the beginning of the Bible study mentioned that Elohim is also a word used for God, big G, is because he is a spiritual authority, but he is the almighty spiritual authority. He showed them in the land of Egypt that he was the most powerful Elohim. He was the biggest Elohim. He was the spiritual authority over all of these little gods and all these little idols that they had and that they had seen from other nations. He showed himself to be more powerful than all of those idols to the nation of Israel specifically. They saw him do all these mighty acts in Egypt and essentially go against all of these gods that Egypt had. And that showed that he was worthy of all of their worship. He didn't want them to worship any of those other gods because they saw for themselves that he was the most powerful. All right. So, question, based on what we've learned.
All right. So while Nobi just talked about idols, I am going to be touching on what is idolatry. And so a lot of you guys really answered this question very well. We can go to the next slide. You all pretty much answered this very well. So we're just going to kind of look at the Oxford definition of idolatry first, which is the worship of idols. And so Zenobia did a good job of really breaking down that word idols and the root of it and like where it came from. And then we can see the second definition says extreme admiration, love, or reverence for something or someone. And so I thought it was important for us to really break down these words to really understand the fullness of what idolatry entails outside of just graven images, right? And so the first word, extreme, which is very important for this definition, is reaching a high or the highest degree, very great, right? And then the next three words, we're just going to kind of break that down and then revisit all of them together. So, admiration is a feeling of deep respect, approval and wonder or delight towards someone or something, often sparked by talent, skill, or virtue. We can go to the next slide. And then we see here that love is an intense feeling of deep affection and a great interest and pleasure in something. And then reverence is a feeling of deep respect, often mixed with love, awe, or veneration, typically directed towards something sacred, excellent, or of great moral significance. So these things alone are not bad. So love, we know all these things in itself is not bad, but when you add that extreme to it, when you put those things on a high pedestal, and most of those things are deeply rooted from some sort of respect or reverence that you have for a person that has a certain skill, that has a certain talent. We talked about celebrities. We talked about the love of maybe like sports or whatever the thing that is piquing your interest or has a moral significance and has like a sense of something or someone that you want to be like. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see a deeper understanding of idolatry from the Hebrew perspective, which means teraphim. And it means idols and images, which Zenobia talked about in the first half. And then teraphim itself, that actual word is small images or cult objects used as domestic deities or oracles by Hebrews, so something that you worship. So again, she discussed like how they worship idols back in the day. And then the family idols, we saw the consequences of us actually that in the second commandment, when we do have other idols, how they are passed down through generations. And so that is something to be mindful of as well, is that when we fall into idolatry, that is the consequences of that is that falling along our bloodline, which goes a bit deeper, which we'll talk about later. And so the main thing I want to focus on in this definition is the definition that idolatry is a healer. And so the root word of teraphim is rapha, which means to heal, cure, repair, make whole, and to mend. And so ultimately, the question we want to ask is, who is your healer? We can go to the next slide. We see that through idolatry, in simple terms, it's anything that we put our trust in to be our healer. That so we fall into idolatry when we stop trusting Yah to be our healer, and we put that trust into other people, places, and things to become whole. So again, what are you running to? What are you coping with? What are you replacing with God? And so idolatry is a sign that you are broken somewhere and are in need of a healer. And so, for example, I'll use my story, for instance, like when I was in the world, when I was a child, I had father wounds and father issues. So later on in life, that showed up, idolatry showed up in me coping with weed, me coping with alcohol, me coping with bad perspective and revelation with men. Those things became idols in my life because I was relying on those things to heal me from a wound that only God could. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see that Yah presents himself as Jehovah Rapha, which is our healer. And so we see this in Exodus 15, where he first introduces this title, this characteristic of himself. And it reads, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your Elohim and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you, which I have brought on the Egyptians. For I am Yahweh who heals. And so, if we look at this and break this down a bit, we see that there is a prerequisite. He is requiring obedience. He is requiring that you listen to him. He is requiring that you keep his commandments. And so, Zenobia briefly touched on like the diseases that went upon the Egyptians. And it's good to see here. It's not that God is this dictator that's like, you need to follow me because, or I will keep my healing from you. But it's, he loves us so much that he gives us these commandments to keep us from sickness, to keep us from sin. And so it's through our obedience to his word that we are in alignment with partaking in his healness, because he keeps us from enduring the sins of the world and the consequences that come with them. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see that there is a consequence to disobedience. When we are disobedient, it causes us to fall into idolatry along with sin. And we learned before in another Bible study that sin makes us sick. And so we all were born into sin. So we all have experienced some form of brokenness, some form of hurt, pain, disease, whether that's physical, mental, whatever that looks like. And so naturally we have tried to self-medicate, and that looks differently for every person. And so that is why accepting Yeshua into your heart and allowing him to be your savior, you give him the access to be your healer, but that doesn't go away automatically. You have to put down the things that you once turned to. And so we see that anything that leads you to be disobedient to Yah's instruction is idolatry. And I tried to sum it up in like a simple way, because we talk about anything that we put before God, but we don't really know what we put before him without being tested to see. Like Abraham, God told him to take his only begotten son and to worship him, to give him up as a sacrifice. And he did that to make sure that his blessing was not an idol in his heart. And so another practical example is that God told you to leave a relationship, whether that's with a female or a male, like romantically, or just like a friendship. God told you to leave that relationship alone, but you don't do it. You have now made that person your idol. God told you to leave a job, but you don't do it. That God now becomes your idol because it's causing you to be disobedient to God, and your faith is relying in that person, in that thing, to give you whatever it is that you think that they can provide for you, that you feel like God can't. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see that when we come into agreement with Yah, that there is a covenant that is made that we are committing to. And so just to kind of continue in Exodus with the children of Israel, here in Exodus 24, 7 through 8, we see this is the first time that they actually come into the covenant. So we learned that how God presented to them, like what the rules would be. This is what I'm inviting you to be a part of with me. Now here in Exodus 24 is when they actually make the covenant official. And so it reads, then he took the book of the covenant and read to the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has said, we will do and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you according to these words. And so the children of Israel committed to Yah and said, we're going to commit to doing what you say you're going to do, what you tell us to do. We're going to commit to being obedient to you because we trust in you and we trust in the covenant that we're making, and we trust you to be our God. And so just in layman's terms, to bring it back to us, when we are in agreement and we agree to be in a covenant with Yah, we are committing to abide in his commandments and his instructions. And we saw that his first and second commandments told us that we should not have any gods before us. We should not make any graven images before us. And honestly, when you're not in covenant with God, you can't fall into idolatry because he is the person that made the commandment. So when you choose to be in a covenant with God and have Yeshua as your Lord and Savior, you are now saying, there, you are my one and only God, and there is no other God that's going to be before me. There is no other God that I'm going to put in your place, and I'm committing to worshiping you and only you. And we'll see in the next slide where it talks about how, although they made this comment, we can go to the next slide. Although they made this comment, they turned around and then proceeded to make a golden calf. And so in Exodus 32:1, it reads, now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, come, make us gods that shall go before us. And for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So the moment that they started to get frazzled, the moment that they started to doubt, the moment that they started to lack trust in the covenant that they had with God, They wanted to create their own God. They wanted to create something that would be self-soothing and make them feel better. They fell into the ways of the Egyptians and was like, let's just make a God and let's just worship it. And then we'll see a couple verses down. That's not quoted here, but if you all read in the story of Exodus 32, you'll see that they started to give this golden calf the credit and say, they thank the golden calf for bringing them, delivering them out of the hand of Egypt. And we saw that God was saying, like, he kept saying, I am the God. He kept telling him, I'm the one who delivered you. I'm the one who delivered you. I'm the one who delivered you. All for them to sit up and make a golden calf and then give the golden calf the credit for what God did. And so when we lose our trust in God, we start seeking new gods, so new little g gods, to replace him and handle the areas that we think he's forgotten about. If he's not moving in the time that we thought he should move, we're like, oh, well, maybe I could just help God out. God don't need your help. He don't need you to assist him with nothing. He just needs you to be obedient and do what he said to do. And so when we start getting frazzled and antsy, we start putting ourselves in a position for the enemy to come in and start leading us to worship other things outside of God. And so lastly, I just want to say with this next slide, let's try to acknowledge the idols that we may have. And so in Second Chronicles 7:14, it says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. And so, honestly, we all were born into sin. And again, like, we've all experienced a space of brokenness, and we've all have been in a space to where we're in need of a healer, we're in need of a savior, and we all fall short of the glory of taking on things and relying on things that are outside of God and his will. And so he just wants us to humbly come before him and ask him to expose the things in our hearts that are not of him, expose the things that are coming up that we are putting our trust in outside of him. And I think ultimately just taking real inventory of the things that, what has God called you to do in this season or in other seasons that you have not done? What has kept you from being obedient to him? And when we start to ask those questions, then we can kind of pinpoint where our idols lie. And so ultimately, let's try to ask y'all to reveal the idols that are in your heart and pray for them to be removed. And that's a consistent prayer that you have to work out, and know that even when you get delivered from those idols, the enemy knows that they were once idols in your life. So he's going to continue to test you in those areas and try to bring them back and make you rely on the place of where you once used to. And so the next question that we're going to ask and discuss is going to be, is there anything in your life now or in the past that you have made an idol? And we can stop the recording.